Good evening. I'm Dr. M. Andrew Holochek, and I come to you from my hermitage in Lynchburg, and I'm going to do another book review for you today. The book is Jefferson and Monticello, The Biography of a Builder by Jack McGlaughlin. Now, this is one of my favorite books on Thomas Jefferson, and I say that not because everything McGlaughlin writes is to the point and right on the money, but he writes a book the way a book's supposed to be written. First, the title, Jefferson and Monticello, The Biography of a Builder. He's going to offer us a biography of Thomas Jefferson from the a perspective that's never been done, Thomas Jefferson as a builder. It's not Thomas Jefferson architect. This is Thomas Jefferson builder. And as the principal title, Jefferson and Monticello, suggests, is that the focus will be on Jefferson building Monticello, how he went about building Monticello. So, um, right off the bat, it's an intriguing book. The title is apt, right on the money. It tells you what the book's about. The chapters, the 10 chapters throughout, talk about different stages of the process of building. Um, all the chapters, almost all the chapters, many of the chapters have quotes for their titles, and it's well structured. Now, McLaughlin begins by warning readers. He says this is not the usual kind of Jefferson biography, and that's fine. But he's not focusing. I mean, there are many different prisms through which we can see Thomas Jefferson, or lenses through which we can see Thomas Jefferson. I have a book, Thomas Jefferson Moralist, that focuses on Thomas Jefferson the Moralist. I have one on Jefferson as a philosopher of education, and McLaughlin's book here, and other book. There are books on Jefferson as an architect, and all other. Jefferson as the master of Monticello, or Jefferson as a farmer, books and papers and all that. And all these are legitimate topics here for biographies or biographical essays. And of course, my dog wants to come up, knowing that I'm on doing one of these. Come on, Jeffy. Sit down now. We got to go. Okay, so McLaughlin writes, the prism through which I view this life is the most creative artifact of an exceptionally creative man, Monticello, the prison, the house he put up and pulled down for most of his adult years. Now, he put up and pulled down, that's a quote. I think that's from Margaret Bayard Smith, I'm not sure, but talking about how Jefferson loved to put up and pull down. And I've said before in numerous writings that the wording is so uniquely Thomas Jefferson, even if someone else is quoting Jefferson, because it's not pulling down then putting up. Jefferson was always interested in the process of building, and so he was never finished. It was also putting up and pulling down. Suggests a process that's never ended, and that to me is just sort of like Jefferson, the way he viewed his life. Is that there's never a point where you get where you're going in life. You're constantly building. You're constantly tearing down, putting up, tearing down again, and so forth. Okay, so McLaughlin's going to focus on Jefferson as a builder, and there wasn't necessarily a neat separation between architects and builders. There weren't all that many professional architects in Jefferson's day. He was probably the foremost architect of his day, according to numerous architectural historians, Fisk, Kimball, and so forth. Um, we talk about how McLaughlin rightfully notices that Jefferson has to focus on process, not outcome, and he focused on that. Now we have 10 uh, chapters to that, and what's really sort of fun about the book and unique, I think, about the book is that I'm not a builder. I'm not even an architect, but I know a little bit about architecture. My father was an architect, but I've studied a lot of the books and the writings of friends, Richard Guy Wilson and Jefferson in architecture, and Palladio. I have his 4 books and so forth. Uh, so if you're unfamiliar with architecture, more specifically the process of building in Jefferson's day, especially building in Virginia and the sort of materials that are available, you're going to get a thorough education. And that was why the book was quite fun for me. He's focusing on a biography of Jefferson from the perspective, a perspective that no one has ever written on, and no one probably would have thought of writing on Jefferson as a builder. Okay. Um, there are things in there that we learn. Now, Jefferson did not, Palladio talked about having circular designs to rooms, and Jefferson preferred octagons. Um, and one scholar goes on to say something so silly um, that Jefferson's employment of octagons and grids was proof of his racism. That's Irene Chen. I found that one of the most humorous things I've ever read, and yet it was published in a fairly important, fairly significant book on Jefferson, and so forth. Anyways, but so why doesn't he go the curved surface route as Palladio suggests? And McGlaughlin writes that curved surfaces are difficult to build, and he's working with timbers, he's working with bricks, and it's difficult to fit windows and doors. Try to have a curved room or a circular room, and put in windows and doors. It's much easier, and furniture fits in much more readily. Okay, we learn other things that where are you going to find the skilled workmen in Virginia? They weren't so readily available. And even when you did find people who were fairly skilled in workmanship as builders, they enjoyed their alcohol. So drunkenness, inebriation was a constant problem, constant notice. Um, what I think is most refreshing in McLaughlin's book is some of the psychological insights that McLaughlin has concerning Jefferson, some of which are spot on. He writes that Monticello was a reflection of Jefferson's compulsive personality. He writes, he retained, either physically or in his memorandum books, virtually everything that passed through his hands during his entire life. So Monticello was like a museum, a collection of all the things that passed through his hands throughout his life, paintings and artwork and Indian artifacts and things like that. Um, and he mentions that Jefferson was happiest, was he was most satisfied and secure when he was saving, measuring, counting, and timing. And I put my own spin on that in Thomas Jefferson's Psychobiography of American Lion. I talk about Jefferson observing, measuring, recording, and critiquing. He had to apply mathematics to everything. So my own spin's a bit different, I think a little bit more accurate, but it's still a very interesting insight. Um, he also wishes to explain his almost violent reaction to the death of his wife Martha in 1782. And even Jefferson's daughter, who was greatly aggrieved by the passing of her mother, this is something that was expected. She was, moribund for quite a while. But when she passed, Jefferson grieved excessively, and it was noticeable by so many people, even his daughter. The daughter writes abundantly about, her father's excessive grieving and how she had to be a partner to him for fear that maybe something crazy might happen. Um, McLaughlin writes that the random abduction of a loved one by death shook the very roots of his being. And he wonders if part of that excessive grieving was due to the fact that he weakened her through numerous pregnancies in the 10 years of their marriage, as well as he had her living in a Monticello that was never completed. That was always in the process of construction and never constructed. So she was, she never had a finished house. The roof half the time was not even completed. So was he grieving because he could have done better for her? I would add that, of course, he was engaged in politics so much of the time, and he was away from her. That was part of the grieving process. So he investigates that. That part of the problem vis-a-vis the builder is that he never finishes, and his wife passes away, and she never had a house. He talks about, spot on again, is Jefferson's love of both beauty and functionality. And he mentions, as I have mentioned in numerous places, as other people have mentioned who understand Jefferson's aesthetic sensibility, is that Jefferson always preferred functional beauty. I would say that beauty to him that was most beautiful was functional. He dispreferred things like winding showcase staircases that in the middle of a room that in many mansions just were central figures. As soon as you walk in the house, see this gorgeous stairway. And for Jefferson, it was just wasted space. You could have extra rooms and so forth. So he had this narrow staircase. So for him, McGlaughlin writes, the law of convenience took precedent over any absolute standard of architectural purity. So functionality was the main standard of architectural design or integrity. He wanted beauty, but he wanted functional beauty. Again, McGlaughlin is on the money on that comment. Uh, Something that I had never thought about. It's a point that I've made in subsequent writings, but it's a point that I derived from McGlaughlin, and I talked about this in the One Word, Five Questions with Donald Vitek, is Jefferson as a child. He writes that he says, McGlaughlin says, Jefferson's love of designing, repairing, tinkering with mechanical devices had something of his boyhood excitement at exploring and mastering the physical world. It was childhood play adopted to the adult world. Now, when I read that, and that comes toward the end of his book, it sort of blew me away because I thought, bingo, that describes Thomas Jefferson. He always had a childlike appreciation for the wonders and the beauty of the world, for what humans were capable of doing, building and destroying and improving upon nature. He approached mathematics and he approached the world as a playful mathematician, always trying to improve it. And when building and designing gardens using mathematics and doing the best to create functional beauty. There are many asides to but they're not divagations, i.e., they're not the sort of asides that take us away from our thesis. McGlaughlin's thesis is talking about Jefferson as a builder, and all the aspects of Jefferson as the builder. So he talks about. I'll give you just one such example. McGlaughlin mentions that Jefferson had tremendously large respect for everyday laborers. He studied their workmanship. He studied how they go about working, and McGlaughlin says, it is such men as that who constitute the wealth of a nation, not millionaires. That's a quote from Jefferson when he was talking about he saw an older black builder. He was a blacksmith. His name was Jesse Lewis, and Jefferson was referring to this about this person who's an old man who could retire, but he still practiced his craft. And he says, it is such men as that who constitute the wealth of a nation, not millionaires, which is, I think, a kind of a cool insight. And finally, McGlaughlin gives you throughout, because he's describing a lot of different processes, a large number of aidful pictures. I'll just show one. I'm not going to go into all of that. My book's a little on the beat up side. And so again, this is one of the, I think, a must read for mavens and scholars of Jefferson. I mean, to know Jefferson was a man who wore many hats. He was a man of many talents. He knew very many things. He had great depth of intellection. He had great breadth of intellection, and he knew how to do many things. And he was interested. He was engaged with the world, in so many different fascinating ways, which is why he's one of the most fascinating people of his day. When scholars talk about him as a rapist, a racist, a hypocrite, it boils my blood in some regard, because here is a guy who understood one of the principles of Stoic and virtue ethics. Happiness is that engagement in the world with other people in tasks well worth doing is part and parcel of what it means to live a happy life, helping other people, but involving oneself in other things. Here comes Jeffy again, just before we say goodbye. So anyway, I think, this is, I 5 stars for McLaughlin's book. I'm a very, very um, heavy, as it were, critic of works on anything, because I think people, when they write a book, they go off on tangents. They don't you don't have a thesis. You don't stick with that thesis. They go off on too many tangents, and you wonder, as a friend of mine wrote a very, very large book on Thomas Jefferson. I won't talk about his name or what, but then he goes off on 10 or 12 pages in one chapter on some aside, a very interesting aside. And I, finally asked him, I said, well, why was that included? I said, was this a paper that you had written, didn't get published, and you sort of in frustration at not getting it published, you wanted to slip it in somewhere? He goes, yeah, how did you know? Well, I knew because it doesn't fit. So I mean, a good writer will have the discipline to make passages fit. If you want to have an aside, should not stray all that much from the thesis. Sometimes the sides are just entertaining and fun, but it still should. You should be able to say, well, still that talks and helps us understand what it means for Jefferson to be a builder. So again, I highly recommend McLaughlin's book, and it was 19, I think, 88 when it was published, and it has lost throughout the years none of its vitality. So highly recommended. Take care, and we'll do this again at some future date. Have a good night.